Thank you for joining me today on TBR, where we will be in conversation with Steve Crawshaw today, journalist and human rights expert, on his latest book, Prosecuting the Powerful. Steve, you were in Egypt after the revolution of the Tahrir Square. You were also toasting to Putin's first ever election victory at the Catherine Palace in 2001. You were reporting on the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. You were advocating with UN Security Council members before their first ever referral to the ICC in 2005. You were also there for Mahinda Rajapaksa's, as you call it, post-war victory lap conference in Sri Lanka. You have organized side events at G8 summits. You have, walked up uninvited to elusive Serbian leaders' London hotel rooms. My favorite story. The list goes on, frankly. But tell me, in all honesty, Steve, is there any event of significance in the last few decades that you might have missed?
I'm sure there are millions that I might have missed, yes. But as you say, I've been very lucky, as so often with life, it's often by chance. Sometimes it's less by chance, but I've been fortunate to be at quite a few moments of history, both when I was a journalist at The Independent and then later working for human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And it was a huge privilege. And I guess that although it's not directly the theme of this book, which is about war crimes and justice and accountability, I am very formed as a person, things which happened much longer ago at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of the rigid barriers in Eastern Europe collapsing. And I had lived in Poland in 1980 at a time of extraordinary change, and I saw what led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And those were some of the most extraordinary moments in my life, of seeing the courage of ordinary people and how that could just flip things around. And of course, in the meantime, we've seen it in many other different places, the Arab Spring and many different contexts. But that was extraordinary to live through, and it definitely influences me to the present day.
Steve, you have brought together all these very interesting world events, people from across geographies together in a book to make a very compelling read, because you're putting together stories that are shaping and changing our idea of rights and keeping up hope throughout. I find that a really well done project. But tell me, what key lessons do you think history has for us that you want to convey through the book?
First of all, thank you for the nice things you said. And storytelling is indeed at the heart of what I tried to say. So I'm not even a lawyer. It's very much about the law in some ways. But I'm not trained in the law, but I have seen the incredible things that when the law is used well, what that can do. And I guess the lessons, I was flicking through something thinking, I should really have quoted that in the book. A wonderful quote from Benjamin Ferencz, who is one of the characters in the book, he was there as a young man in 1945 in Germany as it was being defeated, played an incredibly important part at the International Criminal Court later and many other things, and died just a couple of years ago at the age of 102 or something. And he, towards the end of his life, was asked for the three main lessons. And he said, lesson 1, never give up. Lesson 2, never give up. Lesson 3, never give up. And I thought that actually is kind of the lesson of many of the people that I am describing here, both in the past, extraordinary people who've made change against all of the odds, and we are also seeing it today. I mean, incredibly courageous Syrians who have contributed towards extraordinary change in Ukraine. And when I was in Israel and West Bank last year, all of these people, they're fighting against the odds. Again and again, people will kind of go like, yeah, it's kind of sweet, it's nice, but that's never going to change anything. But in fact, it's those people who were often the self-described Don Quixotes, tilting at windmills. This will never go anywhere. And actually, those people have changed things. So that, I think, I have seen it happen in so many contexts. And I find that just fascinating and inspiring to see.
Steve, you have spent a considerable amount of time in the book charting out how autocrats across the world behave and what do they do. Can you help us join the dots and list out key 5 ways in which autocrats circumvent the law?
I guess that one of the key things is they find support often in the most cynical ways by attacks on others, which is supposedly defense of your own people, but actually it's defense of your own power very often. But othering others and then often leading to terrible crimes against those others, it all helps to keep you in power. And that's a kind of pattern that we have seen again and again. People also like to, in a sense, proclaim themselves above the law and or find other powerful friends who can help them to stay above the law. It's interesting how again and again the International Criminal Court is described as, a conspiracy against me, or before that the war crimes tribunals on the Balkans or on Rwanda, a conspiracy against me. And each of those different ones says this is a conspiracy against me, when actually, of course, those tribunals are trying to make sure that they are looking at the crimes not according to who has committed them, but how serious the crimes are. And I think it's up to all of us not to look at crimes according to whether it's our friend or our enemy who has committed those crimes, but just say, this should not be happening. And those autocrats fundamentally don't care about stability. They often talk about stability, but in practice, what they are doing is creating a more unstable world. And that's true whether it's Putin with his various wars that he has declared. Now there's an arrest warrant out for him at the International Criminal Court. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, he says he's about defending Israel and defending Israelis. But the most brilliant Israelis who I was speaking to were saying, why do you guys in the West give him such a soft ride when actually he is worsening stability? That was true of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia as well, which I covered as a journalist. He claimed that he was for peace. He told me, oh, I am for peace. But actually he needed those conflicts in order to stay in power. And finally his own people threw him out. I witnessed that. It was a great privilege to see it. And his own government, an elected government, then delivered him up to the Hague. So all of the time, these autocrats are coming up with excuses why the rules don't apply to them. But actually, we need to understand, I think, that they always do.
You have, through a very insightful chapter in the book, gone on to explain how 4 countries that collaborated as the prosecuting powers post-World War II at the Nuremberg trials didn't really follow through on respecting international human rights laws themselves, and must say very shortly thereafter. Do you think these were just terrible exceptions, but exceptions still the same?
I wish. And that, as I was writing the book, I realized how extraordinary it was. So my starting point was we had Nuremberg trials in 1945 and the years immediately after, which prosecuted the Nazis, senior Nazis, for their worst crimes. And that was very admirable in its way. It had its problems, but it was certainly admirable. And then I thought, okay, after that, there's 50 years of nothing really, until you then get the tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and the International Criminal Court that begin in the 90s and the early 21st century. And I thought, okay, what did happen during those 50 years? And then I realized if you look at it more carefully, as you just said, all of the 4 prosecuting powers committed terrible crimes of their own. So the Soviet Union under Stalin and so on, of course, it was unsurprising that he committed very grave crimes against the peoples of the Baltic states and other countries, indeed his own people. But if you then look at the imperial powers, so Britain, France, and America were the 3 other prosecuting powers in Nuremberg. Britain, my own country, its imperial behavior, for example, in Kenya, but Kenya is just one example, was torture on a grand scale. And they knew they were doing it. So the Attorney General at that point writes to the governor, so the 2 colonial figures, to say, if we must sin, we must sin quietly. They knew they were committing crimes, and they knew that they wanted to cover it up. This was not something where there could be any ambiguity. And it took 60 years for that to be confronted. So on the one hand, the darkness is there, but to some extent, you can also be pleased that after 60 years, because of the incredible determination of survivors of the terrible things that the British then colonial rulers did at that time. That finally was addressed, and both financially to some extent, but also just the truth was being told. Very important. I give the example of France and Algeria, again, even worse if possible. Again, complete denial. Works about that were literally, the truths were simply not spoken. And again, in recent years, under President Macron, there has been like, okay, we shouldn't have done this, and acknowledgement. Incredible it takes that long, but also I think it's important that things are finally heard, because that truth is what I think helps to bring a kind of stability and moving on in history more generally.
Coming to Putin, in 2006, he cracked down on civil society through a series of laws. Do you think that was a kind of a turning point where the global clampdown of human rights organizations started from? Can it be traced that back to that? And an additional question of what would a world without human rights organizations look like?
That's interesting. Your second question is difficult for me to answer as someone who's been so much involved with human rights organizations. I think that speaking of truth to power and the strengthening of civil society, there's on the one hand the global civil society organizations, but then the local organizations which they work with. And I think both those global and those domestic, local, regional organizations are both really important as providing a framework for people's voices, if you like. And so it is really important. And sometimes even when they seem not to be gaining victories, you realize in a historical perspective, actually, those voices paved the way for victories that came later. Again, many examples of that. As regards Putin, it's interesting. You're quite right that the clampdown in 2006 on the NGOs, civil society organizations in Russia, was really important, and we've seen it with many, many, many other countries around the world in the meantime. To be honest with you, I would say that the turnaround in Russia, more generally, the direction of travel, was visible even earlier than that. And I think that Western governments and governments more generally around the world failed significantly to recognize the malign influence of Putin from a very early stage. So even as he became prime minister and then president in 1999-2000, he was launching an absolutely lawless attack in Chechnya, so an area of Russia, which was restive for sure, but the number of civilians that he killed in his war against Chechnya was absolutely staggering and matched the kind of things that he did later in Ukraine, that Assad did later in Syria, and indeed what we've seen from Netanyahu in Gaza. And nobody reacted. They treated Putin as if he were their best friend. Literally, they rolled out the red carpet for him in countries around the world. And that, I think, it doesn't need any hindsight to see that. That was very, very short-sighted. So yes, 2006 was an important moment in terms of that crushing of civil society. But I think another lesson needs to be, don't just go, oh, well, he's our friend on this theme, so we'll turn a blind eye to all those other things. Because often that's going to it will come and bite you later.
You also quote the ex-UK Prime Minister Tony Blair to have said that the rules of the world are changing. Do you think there's something deeply shifting even today? I mean, Tony Blair said that in a post-9/11 world where there were new security challenges and rule of law was itself questioned rather than strengthened. But cut to the Trump era, do you think the rules of the world are changing again?
So those of us who lived through the 9/11 era after the awful attacks of the 11th September 2001, where planes were flown into buildings, thousands were killed. It was really horrific crimes were committed at that time. And it was dismaying, to put it in its mildest, that democratic governments, especially the US, but also the UK and other governments, took the lesson from that. Well, if they're breaking the rules so badly, then we need to as well. So that was already quite worrying. And I think in retrospect, I mean, it was clear at the time, but certainly in retrospect, the torture that was seen at Abu Ghraib prison, in Iraq and elsewhere, of course, made the world more dangerous, not less dangerous. It's obvious that that's going to happen. It acted, if you like, as a recruiting sergeant for those who believe that terrorism was a solution to anything. Gradually, we moved away from that. Now, as you say, with President Trump, we have a complete lawlessness, and we really do have a different world at the moment. We have somebody who we've seen, he doesn't believe in justice for himself. He doesn't believe in justice for those his supporters who've committed crimes and who were due to be prosecuted or had been, but who he is then ready to pardon. And of course, he doesn't care about crimes being committed around the world. So I think that it is incredibly important for governments around the world to confront that kind of lawlessness that we're seeing from Trump and to say we can't have that. At the time of our conversation, we are already seeing that governments are ready to speak out, for example, when he seems to be more in bed with Putin than ready to support Zelensky in Ukraine. That's troubling enough. But I've been interested that European governments have been less ready to confront him, where he is almost publicly, well, he has publicly pretty much declared he would like to destroy the International Criminal Court. Why does he want to destroy it? Precisely because the International Criminal Court is ready to prosecute without fear or favor. And I think that governments around the world, and all of us, citizens as well, need to speak out on those themes.
That gives me a very important segue into my question on the International Criminal Court itself. Steve, you have written that the creation of ICC as a court that could prosecute war crimes anywhere in the world was described by its first president as humanity's finest hour. But in the 2 decades since its creation, it has been called many more things. It was called anti-African, a colonial court, a political tool, just to name a few. A PR agency was famously hired to discredit the court, and it has been criticized for its lack of impact, with only 5 convictions to show off for atrocity crimes. You have just mentioned the sanctions that have been imposed against it by Trump, but from Trump to Taliban, everybody is questioning the legitimacy of the ICC. What is its relevance today?
So people who might be prosecuted in a court, of course, are not going to like that court. And that's true whether that's in domestic courts or in international courts. And I think that we need to understand the importance of an institution existing. As you rightly said, there's been many criticisms of it over the years, and I think there were problems which it's begun to address. But under the current prosecutor and with the institution itself, it's made clear that their job is to go wherever is needed. Very recently, we saw the delivery of the former president, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines. So a former leader is arrested in his own country and delivered to The Hague.
Finally.
That is a really important signal, because often people are saying, like, what does this actually do? So we can see that it does. We can see already that the travel plans, at the very least, of Vladimir Putin from Moscow or Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel, they are constrained in where they can go, because there's an obligation. If you're a member of the court, you have to arrest. So, for example, Putin didn't go to South Africa. It's been highly unlikely and impossible that we will see Netanyahu arriving in a European capital soon. European governments are frightened that they might need to arrest him, but I think on balance he is unlikely to come. All of those things give us a reminder there is this institution which does have legitimate power and can send a signal. And Duterte, although he may not be the most famous person in the world, I think that's a very interesting signal as well. And it can be the court. When I was speaking to the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, shortly after he had requested arrest warrants for Netanyahu and others, he talked about the court as a catalyst, potentially. Of course, the court can't deal with all the crimes being committed, but you want others to be thinking about the possibilities of justice. And again and again and again, we see the survivors of the worst crimes or their families determined absolutely determined to see some kind of justice. And by justice, that includes not just in a courtroom, but also the idea of truth being told and some kind of reparation. All of those things together, there is more desire and demand for that than I think there has ever been, and I really welcome that.
Steve, you have made a case for technology in aid and defense of human rights. One of the earlier examples that you give is a telling story from Sri Lanka. Let me read this interesting excerpt. The arrival of smartphones changed things. In 2009, at the end of a bloody 28-year war against Tamil rebels, the Sri Lankan government talked of zero civilian casualties, even as its armed forces targeted hospitals and killed tens and thousands of civilians. When human rights organizations and aid agencies sounded the alarm, we were ignored. The UN Security Council failed to pass a single resolution condemning the slaughter. There were many reasons for government's failure to speak out, but there was one key reason for the lack of interest: the fact that there were no images from inside what the Sri Lankan authorities described as a no-fire zone. The deadly catastrophe that unfolded on and around the sandy beach at Mullaitivu in the northeast of the country was mostly invisible to the outside world. Only with the broadcast in 2011 of Sri Lanka's killing fields and other Channel 4 documentaries, which included videos and other phone video material, did the conversation change.
Thank you for focusing on that. Yes, the Sri Lanka stuff really influenced me enormously. So I was based in New York at that time, and it was incredible to watch how nothing happened. And I was happy that I had a very small part to play in making those documentaries happen, which I believe they could make change, but I never really sensed quite how much those extraordinary documentaries would change. And that was a little bit of a turning point of material. By the time we got to 2011, only a couple of years after that, the Arab Spring, at that point, of course, digital phone video material was everywhere, and which was absolutely huge.
Steve, if I can interrupt here, AI can make it really difficult to understand what the truth is, because it can create a different alternative reality. It can remove all evidences and create new ones. Won't it be impossible to differentiate what is truth and what is not?
And you're absolutely right. And I think that's a fear for all of us, deep fake. I mean, all of these things where you look and you go, whoa, it really actually looks like that person saying it. And you have to have a real manual override. And it's understandable that many people don't have that manual override of I need to double check, I need to triple check, is it really? And then even if you do have that, you may go down rabbit holes which suggest, yes, this actually happened, or, alternative truths, to use Donald Trump's terrible phrase. You don't have alternative truth, there's a truth. But I think it's interesting that in context of courtrooms, there's something created just in the last few years called the Berkeley Protocol. It's called Berkeley Protocol because a lot of the work on it began at Berkeley University in California, but working together with the United Nations and really, if you like, harnessing digital work, both in order to be able to show what has generally happened. Where did those missiles come from? How did they happen? Where did this attack happen? When did this attack happen? And through that, potentially, who committed this attack? And working out what is true and not true. And the Berkeley Protocol has had a lot of professional input to be able to disentangle those truths from lies. But you're right, of course, and all of us know it. It's very, very challenging. I would only say that before that, you simply didn't know at all because the evidence wasn't there. And the classic example I refer to on that is Hama in Syria, where a huge massacre under Bashar al-Assad's father took place, where many, many people were killed, but almost nothing could be proved or properly known about what was happening because there was no visual evidence. That was in 1982. 30 years later, when there was again terrible killing in Syria, people did know. And if you didn't know, it was kind of because you didn't want to know at some level. And that's obviously a different subject.
Why do you write on rights?
What else is there to write about? Why do I write on rights? My whole life has been about seeing people achieving extraordinary things. Sometimes I've been privileged enough to be part of that, but very often just getting to know people who are doing extraordinary things. And that has inspired me for so many years in different contexts around the world. And I love seeing the different ways that the impossible becomes possible. People mock those who are trying and say this will never happen, and then it does. And I love to see that process.
How difficult was it to write on ongoing human rights violations in the context of Gaza, Ukraine, when the wars were ongoing, even as I presume your book was going into print? How do you decide when it was time to stop writing and like put down the proverbial author's pen?
With great difficulty, and my publishers were extremely tolerant. So there's kind of two things with the book. Inevitably, things are always happening, and at some point, as you say, you need to just close it. But you're also right to say things were changing in a very dramatic way in 2024 when I was writing the book, in ways that if I didn't include it, the book would actually feel wrong after publication. So eventually, I'm glad that we went to press after the US election results, which was like a fork in the road in many ways. And we had already seen by that time, it was more than a year since the attacks of the lawless and brutal attacks of 7th of October by Hamas and their friends, and then the brutal assault by Israeli forces between 2023 and 24 and continuing to the present day. And so by that stage, you could see a great degree of the crimes that had been committed in Gaza and indeed also in the West Bank by Israeli settlers and others there, and also what Putin had been doing in Ukraine, even if those two were continuing. So my focus in the book and in my thinking was what possibilities of accountability are there on that? And there I was lucky with the timing that I could say, this is where we are, but not only, for example, has the prosecutor requested an arrest warrant, which was still then an open question for 6 months. 6 months, the judges looked at what was happening and wasn't happening. And then in November 2024, just before we went to press, an independent panel of judges confirmed that the arrest warrant was appropriate. In other words, not saying that he is guilty or not guilty, but that there is sufficient evidence to make it worth prosecuting it. So both with Putin and with Netanyahu, and of course Hamas figures as well, there was also arrest warrants issued for those, we could see that there is a need for justice to happen. How or when that justice can happen, that's still a question which is going to be long term, and many of the examples from the past have shown us that justice often takes a long while to come. But just because it hasn't come yet doesn't mean it's not going to come. And I think that's a mistake that often people make. People go like, oh, it's been going on for a couple of years and like nothing's happening. It was true in former Yugoslavia when Alice covered that. People said he's never going to face justice. And when I met Milosevic, he himself said, I'm for peace, we will prosecute people. Both of those were lies. But he, although he certainly believed when we met that he would not face justice, only 9 years later he was delivered to the Hague.
So there is hope in prosecuting the powerful.
Things can happen, everything can change, and we shouldn't just look at what is happening today and say it proves that nothing is going to happen. The reason things happen is partly because we now have good institutions, but it's also because amazingly determined citizens have shown such courage and brilliance and willpower that things have changed, and those kind of things still can change in the future, I'm convinced of.
Okay, I would have personally liked to read more about stories on how arts contributed to the struggle. That is one place that I found was missing in the book, personally for me. But in your opinion, how do you think the world of arts has been instrumental in securing our rights, if they have been?
I think arts are amazing. Funny enough, I actually wrote, and we hadn't prepped this at all, but I had written a different book where arts and creativity in making change is absolutely central. Street Spirit, where Ai Weiwei wrote the foreword, I was very happy for that. So I think of art as being crucial. If art doesn't play such a role in this book, it's because fundamentally it was looking at what happens when people end up in courtrooms, or even not courtrooms, held to account in different ways. But in terms of truth-telling, the arts are so important, and arts are so important in acting as a wake-up moment for societies as well. So no, I can't say, it is impossible to overpraise the role of arts and creativity in making change. Also because in terms of protest, which I've been involved in a couple of books on creative protest, you want creative protest to be fun. That's what gives it energy. And the arts are often about just making things tick. So yeah, the arts are central in so many ways to change.
How did you decide what the book cover would be?
I'm so glad for that question. I love this book cover very much. And I have to say, as an author, I have no input in this at all, except to be asked, do you like it? And I said, I absolutely love it. But I was privileged to meet the designer, Jonathan Pelham, as well since then. It's, for me, I hope that readers like it as well, brilliant in its both succinct storytelling and graphic brilliance. We have 3 pairs of eyes, and then added at a very late stage, 1 extra eye, which readers will have to work who that is. But we have 3 pairs of really bad people who in different ways have been or will be held to account, and then 1 more single eye, which was added in the autumn of 2024. And put together, I think that tells lots of stories.
Steve, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on TBR.
Thank you so much.
And for those of you watching, I will highly recommend the book Prosecuting the Powerful. Whether you are interested in rights, history, politics, or simply care about the world, I think this book should be on your reading list. Thank you for watching.